What's up, guys? Tonight we're going to take a look at the exposure triangle and how you can take more control over your photography by shooting in manual mode. Alright, so the first thing we really want to be thinking about is exposure. Now, what is exposure? Exposure is basically how bright or dark your photo is going to be. It's how much light is getting into the sensor in your camera, how much light is getting picked up to make the final image. And when we're talking about exposure, sometimes we're talking about it being too dark, like this, or it might be too bright, like this. But we really want a photo that looks more like this. So just a few terms to be aware of when we're talking about a photo being overexposed. What we mean is that it's too bright. So something like this obviously is way too bright, and that's overexposed. Another term that's important to understand is underexposed, which is just the opposite, means it's too dark. So a photo like this, way too dark, can barely make out any details in it at all. A properly exposed image is going to be something like that, something where you can still see details in the shadows and in the highlights of your image. One of the things that is most important to pay attention to when you're shooting is the exposure meter. Now, when I show you the details here of my camera, what you're seeing right here, the 0 in the middle and then the minus on the one side, the positive on the other, that's your exposure meter. You can also see it when you're looking through your viewfinder up here. It usually shows up as green illuminated in your viewfinder, and you want to pay attention to that when you're composing your image. That is going to help you to see whether or not your image will be underexposed, overexposed, or properly exposed. And generally, you want it to fall somewhere in the middle. So I'm going to make a few adjustments here and bring it down to about the middle, right about there. That's what it would look like. And of course, if it's overexposed, it'll be towards the plus side there, and underexposed will be towards the negative side. So you want to pay attention to that, and it's going to change based on what you pointed at. If I pointed at something else, you can see I'm not changing any of the settings there, but I'm pointing it at something darker and it got more underexposed. And then I change it, bring it back this way, and point it at something a little brighter, and it comes back up. So it's going to change based on what you're pointing the camera at. So when you start photographing something different, you want to recheck that exposure meter. And generally speaking, try to have it around the middle. Now, there are exceptions to that, but I'll save that for a later episode. So now that you know what the exposure meter is, you need to know how to adjust the settings and what settings to adjust in order to get that proper exposure. So you can see up here at the top of the camera, I've got my setting on M there, which is manual. And your camera's dial might look a bit different, but having it on manual mode will allow you to adjust all of the settings manually as needed. The camera is not choosing the settings for you, you are choosing the settings yourself. And there's going to be some benefit to that, as you'll see in a minute. Now, when we are talking about exposure and how much light we are letting into the camera, we need to talk about the exposure triangle. There are 3 settings that you need to be aware of that will influence how much light is getting in to make a properly exposed image. Number 1 is aperture. Aperture is this number that you see right here, the f number or the f-stop, that's the aperture. Now the aperture is basically like the pupil of your eye. It's a little hole inside the lens that can get bigger or smaller and determines how much light is getting through the lens. Now that's really important. It's important to know what the aperture is on your lens, how big or how small it can get, and I can adjust it by turning the front dial right there, and you can see this is showing me my settings right here as well. I can illuminate that, and when I turn this front dial, that's adjusting the aperture, the f-stop. And right now the biggest that I can get on this lens is f2.8. That's a pretty big aperture. One thing that's really important to understand when we're thinking about aperture is that the number is inverted. So the smaller the number, the bigger the aperture. That's something that you've got to remember, something really important to remember. So in this case, f2.8, that's the smallest number I can get, which means it's the biggest aperture that this lens has. Then if I go this way, the numbers are getting bigger, but the aperture is getting smaller. And one of the ways that you can tell that is that you can see as I make the number bigger, look what's happening to the exposure meter. It's getting more and more underexposed, less light is coming in, which tells you that the aperture is getting smaller. Less light is able to get through the lens. So remember that, small number equals big aperture. So the aperture is one of the things that you can manipulate to let in more or less light to make a properly exposed image. One of the other things that aperture does is aperture also determines the depth of field of your image. So what I mean by that is the amount of your image that is going to be in focus. So if I switch over to live view here, right now I have it on the biggest aperture and it's in focus on my handy Peterson field guide here. And you can see that the background is very blurry, it's very out of focus, and only the book itself is sharp and in focus. If I play with the settings a bit here, and I'm just going to try to keep a proper exposure, but I'm starting to make a smaller aperture. You can see that more of the image is in focus when I have it on f22. So the smaller your aperture, the bigger the depth of field, or the more of your image that is going to be in focus. Whereas a larger aperture, if I bring it back down all the way, bring this down so you can see again, a larger aperture has a narrower depth of field and results in more of an out of focus, blurry background. Now I like to take pictures of snakes and other reptiles that have this narrow depth of field, has a blurry out of focus background, and so you need to have a lens that has a big aperture that enables you to do that if you also want to get images like that. Now the amount of your image that's in focus is also going to be dependent on the focal length of your lens. If you have a really wide angle lens, more of the image is going to be in focus, even at a fairly big aperture. Whereas if you have a longer focal length, like maybe 100 millimeters or 200 millimeters, that is going to result in a lot of blurry out of focus backgrounds as well. So aperture is the first part of the exposure triangle. Second part of the exposure triangle that you need to know is shutter speed. Shutter speed is this number right here. And you can kind of think of shutter speed a bit like blinking your eye, only the shutter is closed and then it opens briefly to let some light in, and the shutter speed is how quickly it's going to do that. So this number right here, 1/50, that's 1/50th of a second. And if I go this way, that's making it faster. So 1/200th of a second is faster, which means you're going to have less light coming in because it's a quicker shutter speed. And you can tell that again looking at the exposure meter. As I make it faster, it gets more and more underexposed because less light is getting in. When I make it a slower shutter speed, you can see that exposure meter going back up because more light is able to get in because it's a slower shutter speed. Now, one of the things you need to be aware of about shutter speed is that when you start to have really slow shutter speeds, getting down into this range here, you can have motion blur in your image. Let's say you're trying to take a picture of a snake and it's maybe moving a little bit, or it's not sitting still like you'd like it to. You're trying to shoot off some images quickly. Having a slow shutter speed could result in some blurry images, or at least the animal that's moving could have some blur to it. So generally, I like to start with a little bit of a faster shutter speed, so maybe somewhere around there, kind of as a starting point. I may adjust it depending on the situation, but I generally don't want to go too slow because I want to try to avoid any motion blur in the subject that I'm shooting. Now, there are exceptions to that. Again, I'll talk about some of those things at a later time, but as a general rule, I don't want to go too slow, especially if I'm not using a flash, I'm just using natural light. I want to try to keep that shutter speed a little bit higher if I can to make sure I have a nice sharp image and there's no motion blur at all. Now, another possible cause of motion blur in your images may not be from the animal moving at all. It might actually be from you holding the camera and shaking your hands. Some handshake causing some motion blur. And that is something that you need to be aware of as well when you're thinking about shutter speed. And an important rule, this is a general rule that's good to remember, is that motion blur from handshake is related to the focal length of your lens. So if I'm shooting with a 100mm lens, what I need to remember is that I need to have a shutter speed of at least 1/100th of a second. So again, a 100mm lens, I need to have a shutter speed of at least 1/100th of a second. Ideally, a little bit faster than that. Maybe 1/125th of a second, 1/160th of a second, 1/200th of a second, somewhere around there. And that will help to eliminate camera shake from your hands. Now, if you have a wider angle lens, like a 50mm lens, you could go down possibly to even as slow as 1/50th of a second. I would recommend maybe going no slower than 1/60th of a second or 1/80th of a second. You will have to remember that if you're shooting that slow, if your subject is moving, you could get motion blur. This speed will help to eliminate camera shake from your hands, but it won't necessarily eliminate motion blur if you're shooting something that's moving quickly. So if that's the case, let's say you're taking pictures of your family, you've got little kids, you definitely want a higher shutter speed, a faster shutter speed to try to freeze that motion somewhere around there, or even faster if you have enough light to do that. But knowing that rule will help to eliminate any motion blur from camera shake due to having shaky hands. So just remember that. Whatever your focal length is on your lens that you're shooting with, remember that the shutter speed needs to be at least that or faster. So 100mm lens, you need at least a 1/100th of a second shutter speed or faster. So the third part of the exposure triangle is the ISO right there. Now the ISO is basically the sensitivity of the digital sensor in your camera. And it's pretty straightforward. A lower number means the sensor is less sensitive to light. 100 is my base setting. And then a bigger number means the sensor is more sensitive to light. And you can tell, again, looking at the exposure meter, higher ISO, you can tell the image is going to be brighter on the exposure meter. It's getting more towards the plus side. And then a smaller number means it's getting darker over there. Now, something to keep in mind when we're talking about ISO is that, typically speaking, the higher the ISO gets, the more noise is going to be introduced into your final image. Noise is the graininess that you might sometimes see on your images when you're shooting at a higher ISO. Some cameras can handle a higher ISO better without having too much noise, but when I'm shooting reptiles, I generally try to keep the ISO as low as possible. When I'm outside shooting a snake or a lizard or a frog, I'm generally trying to keep the ISO fairly low. So usually if it's dark enough so that I have to get up to about ISO 800 or 1000 in order to have a properly exposed image, what I'm going to do is just bring that ISO back down and use a flash to give me some additional light. I'm not going to push the ISO up too high. I don't like to have lots of graininess or noise in my images of snakes and other reptiles, and I'd rather start using some flash rather than having a super high ISO. Now, I'll talk more about flash and how you can use flash in a subsequent video, but just be aware of that for right now. You can push the ISO way up high on some of these cameras. Mine goes up to 12,800, but once you get that high, the noise or the graininess in the image starts to get almost unbearable to look at. So I like to keep it, like I said, way lower and use external flash if I need some additional light. So just a brief recap on those 3 points of the exposure triangle. First of all, we have aperture, which is the f-stop here. Remember that aperture is the hole in your lens that lets light through, and the bigger the aperture, the more light is going to get through. And that F number, remember, the smaller the number gets, the bigger the aperture is. And the bigger the number is, the smaller the aperture gets. Very important to remember. The second point is shutter speed right there. That's the speed at which your shutter is opening and closing, and pretty simple. The bigger the number is getting there on the bottom, the faster your shutter speed is getting and is letting in less light. The smaller the number there is getting, the slower the shutter speed and the more light is getting in. And when you start to get to slow shutter speeds, you have to start being concerned about motion blur. So I like to start about there as a baseline and then make adjustments from there. And then the third point of the exposure triangle is ISO, which is the sensitivity of the digital sensor, and you can adjust that to make your images brighter or darker as needed. But remember, when you get into numbers that are too high, you're going to introduce noise or grain into your images that I usually like to try to avoid. Now let me talk about a couple of different examples. It's really important to think about some examples as we're trying to learn this topic. So the first example I want to talk about is for a nighttime image. I'm going to talk about flash in another episode, but when I'm shooting at night, I have some settings that I like to start from. My shutter speed, I start at 1/200th of a second. Now, something you'll need to understand is that your camera's shutter speed is limited when you are shooting flash. In the case of my camera, when I'm shooting with flash, 1/200th of a second is the fastest shutter speed that I can use when I'm using flash. I can't go any faster than that, or it starts to affect the image. So that's something you should probably look up in your camera's manual. So I start with 1/200th of a second shutter speed when I'm shooting at night. And typically, when I'm doing nighttime shots, I like to shoot with a smaller aperture. I like to introduce a little bit more detail, especially when I'm doing nighttime macro shots. I usually have an aperture around f13, somewhere around there. I can vary that depending on the situation. And then I also like to keep the ISO low. Usually down around ISO 100. I can bring it up to maybe 200 if I need to, but I like to keep it low at night because I'm using a flash to provide all of my light, and having the ISO at that base setting keeps the grain or the noise to an absolute bare minimum. So those are settings that I like to start with when I'm shooting at nighttime. And again, I'll talk about flash in another episode. Let's think about a second example, shooting in the daytime. Now obviously daytime lighting conditions can vary widely, but usually when I'm going into the field, I probably have my shutter speed somewhere around there, 1/320th of a second. And when it's the daytime, I like to shoot with natural light only if I can. So that usually means I'm going to have to bring the aperture way up. So maybe f4, f4.5, f5, somewhere around there. And then I'll have to bring the ISO up, and maybe I'll have it right around there, ISO 320. That's just kind of a starting point for going into a setting. And then from there, I can look at the exposure meter and I can see, oh, it's going to be too overexposed, or it's going to be too underexposed. I need to adjust some settings to try to get a proper exposure. Now I'm going to switch this over to live view here. So let's say this is my example. I'm shooting this book. We'll just pretend it's a reptile in the field, and I'm looking at my live view right now. Normally I shoot just by looking through the viewfinder, but it's easier in this example to use live view. I'm looking at it. It's really dark. I need to adjust it. And so I am going to look at it and I'm going to say, okay, what can I adjust first? Well, in this case, I can make the aperture bigger. That's one way I can let in some more light. So I can bring it to the maximum aperture setting, f2.8 on this lens, and that's starting to get a little bit better. Then I can bring my ISO up a little bit. Don't want to bring it up too much, but maybe 640 at the most, and that's starting to look better. Maybe a little bit too bright there, so then I bring the shutter speed up. And that's looking pretty good. So just by looking at your exposure meter, again, if we were just looking at this, bring the aperture down to, or up to 2.8, I should say. It's the biggest aperture I've got on this lens. Shutter speed down a little bit, ISO up. And again, you can see it's still a little bit underexposed there. It's a little bit dark, but it's not too bad. And you could even adjust that a little bit in Lightroom or another editing software after the fact as well. That's not too bad. It's not too far off. Well, guys, that's it for tonight's episode. I hope you found it useful. Please feel free to leave me any comments or questions in the comment section below. I'd be happy to talk with you guys, answer any questions that you have. Please make sure to like and subscribe. I'll definitely be having more videos of this kind of content coming up in the near future, so definitely stay tuned, subscribe to make sure you don't miss any of it.